Welcome back to Arise Exchange. A U.S. federal jury has ruled that the Palestinian Authority and the PLO are liable for more than $655 million in damages from terrorist attacks in Israel between 2002 and 2004. This comes just a few months after a lawsuit in New York over a terrorist attack revealed a veil of secrecy about who is hiding what in Arab banks, specifically that banks may be liable for doing business with known terrorist groups. What will banks have to do to keep themselves out of trouble, and how will that impact the funding for these terrorist organizations? Larry Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, joins us now from Washington, D.C. Larry, welcome back to Arise Exchange.
Nice to be with you again.
This is a really interesting story about the banks keeping terrorist money. If you're a successful terrorist group, you need to put your money somewhere. How long have we known about this problem?
Well, we've known about it for at least a decade. In fact, about a decade ago, the courts found that the Arab Bank was actually giving money to Hamas, which was one of the groups that did this horrible thing to these folks in Israel.
And how do we find out who the banks are keeping the money for? You know, it's akin to the Swiss banking situation, where we only found out who was on this list when someone kind of leaked it over the issue of tax evasion, basically, in Switzerland for Americans. But we don't really have access to the names of the clients of these banks, do we?
No, we don't. They don't have anything like, you know, the groups that regulate, you know, our banks or look into it. But what we try and do, we have with Stuart Levy and then David Cohen were undersecretaries of the Treasury. And what they do is they let these banks know that if they continue to do this type of thing, they won't have access to the American banking system. And, you know, that really is the engine for the banking systems around the world. And both Mr. Levy and Mr. Cohen have been somewhat successful in stopping this. But it's almost impossible because the Arab Bank is in, you know, 20 countries. The Saudis have their own bank, and the people who regulate them, you know, really, again, are not transparent.
And when you talk about the Saudi banks, is there some politics going on here? Are we leaning on these countries enough, do you think?
Well, I think we are trying, but again, we have a limited amount of leverage because, you know, as you know, the Saudis want us to be more aggressive in going after, you know, ISIS. We want them to, you know, to do more in dealing with ISIS. And we know, for example, that a lot of Saudi money and money from the UAE ended up funding ISIS in the beginning because they were so adamant to get rid of Assad, they weren't keeping tabs on where the money was going.
So how does this work? Does the chief financial officer of Boko Haram walk into a bank branch, fill out a form, and deposit money? I mean, how does this money get into the bank, and how does it get out of the bank?
Well, I mean, it goes into the bank, and it's like any other bank. If you're the person, you can get it out, or you can tell them to send it someplace. Like, it's pretty clear that we know some of the money from the Arab Bank ended up with Hamas. And a decade ago, the courts, you know, found out that that had happened.
Okay, so how do we successfully strangle out the money, basically, to the terrorist groups? Because if we could cut off their money and get them from these banks, we could do serious damage to them, maybe more so than a military action.
Well, there's no doubt about it. And, you know, if you take a look, you know, Mr. Cohen has just been sent over. He's now the #2 at the CIA. He was so good at doing this. But what you have to do is say, you know, if you're not forthcoming or we find out about this, you're not going to have access to our banking system. And again, that is really critical because these banks can't just sit on the money. They want to invest it someplace, and we can stop that. We do the same thing with banks that are doing business with Iran, you know, to help them get around the sanctions.
And so the incentive to doing business here in the United States is certainly more than the incentive in doing business with these groups.
Well, there's no doubt about that.
Okay. Larry Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress from Washington, D.C. Thank you, as always.
Thanks for having me.